the Honourable Fayval Williams, Minister of Education and Youth, council members of the University Council of Jamaica, members of the Micro-Credentials Standards Committee, representatives from higher education institutions and training providers, private sector stakeholders, special invitees, members of the media, members of staff at the University Council of Jamaica. Good afternoon. Today is a significant milestone in Jamaica's higher education landscape. The launch of the UCJ's standards and guidelines for microcredential. In the ever-evolving realm of higher education, the pursuit of quality is paramount. Today, we gather to emphasize the crucial role that quality assurance plays in ensuring that educational offerings are not only robust, but also responsive to the dynamic needs of our society. Quality assurance in higher education is the bedrock upon which the credibility and effectiveness of academic programs rest. It is the commitment of continuous improvement, rigorous standards, and the delivery of education that equips individuals with skills and knowledge necessary for success in a rapidly changing world. Microcredentials, as outlined in the newly established standards and guidelines, represent a groundbreaking approach to education. These bite-sized, focused credentials provide learners with an agile and flexible means of acquiring special skills and competencies. Today, we celebrate not only the launch of these standards, but also the recognition of microcredentials as a valuable tool in our educational toolkit. As we embark on this journey, it is essential to align our efforts with the vision that transcends the immediate and envisions the future that is both sustainable and prosperous. In the context of Jamaica, this launch is inextricably linked to the vision outlined in Vision 2030 Jamaica. A vision that supports a knowledge-based society, a globally competitive society, driven by innovation and fueled by a highly educated and skilled workforce. Let us today see this launch as a symbol to the collective commitment to higher education excellence in Jamaica. Our recognition of this transformative power of microcredentials and our dedication to the shaping of future in line with Jamaica's Vision 2030. And with that, we invite the presence of the Lord and we ask Mr. Eaton Hendricks to lead us on that charge.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, indeed, we are grateful to you, Lord, for allowing us to see this day that you have made. We are thankful to you, God, for life, for health, and God, for all that you have been blessing us with, Lord. Lord, last week, this time, we were experiencing the rains, but this day, Lord, we are experiencing the sunshine. And we just want to tell you thanks. Lord, we just want to thank you for all the persons who participated in the finalization and the preparation of this, of the micro credential standards, Lord. And Lord, I pray that these standards will be used for the benefit of higher education in Jamaica as the UCJ assures quality education. We commit the afternoon's activities in your hands, and we pray that you just lead and guide us. We tell you thanks. Just in we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Hendricks, for asking the Lord to lead us and to bless this afternoon's proceedings. As we go forth, we welcome our Executive Director, Mrs. Althea Heron, with the welcome and opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Good afternoon, everyone. The established protocol is observed. On behalf of the University Council of Jamaica, I extend warm greetings to you and also to thank you for participating in our launch of microcredentials, guidelines, and standards. Without your attendance and participation, this event would not be possible. Microcredentials have been gaining momentum since 2020 because of the increased demand for short work rating programs. They have become the preferred choice for certification for the workforce and are being used as flexible ways of recognizing and valuing learning obtained formally, informally, and non-formally. COVID-19 has provided the impetus for the rapid implementation of microcredentials globally, as people were exploring flexible certification options. Similarly, employers were retraining workers to best prepare them for the post-pandemic economy and to respond quickly to the anticipated emerging skills needed for the 21st century. The learning experiences through micro-credentials are tailored to give the person the requisite skills or just-in-time learning so that they can upskill or retrain without having to pursue another degree. The recommendations from the UCJ's joint publication with UNESCO on flexible learning pathways in Jamaica, as well as the Jamaica Education Transformation Commission's Reform on Education in Jamaica 2021 report, emphasized the need for the creation of alternative flexible learning pathways for persons to access higher education, and that there should be opportunities to support lifelong learning, education, and training. The development and implementation of a framework for micro-credentials was also endorsed in both documents. Realizing this global trend, in 2021, the UCJ, the National External Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, through its Micro-Credential Standards Committee, started to develop a framework for the quality assurance of micro-credentials. We are thankful for the great tireless efforts of the Standards Committee for Micro-Credentials, whose members brought this document from concept to publication. The Standards Committee was a broad-based working group comprised of national and international representatives from academia, relevant private sector stakeholders, and subject specialists. For those of you who participated in our 17th commemoration of Quality Assurance in Higher Education Week, which was held in March 2022, you will recall that at the webinar themed Micro-Credentials, Developing a Nation Through Lifelong Learning, we announced that the standards were being developed. Subsequently, we had stakeholder consultations on the draft standards in June 2022. Your feedback was invaluable and has been incorporated into the standards being launched this afternoon. So, promise made, promise kept. The standards have been developed to provide higher education institutions, training organizations, and other training providers with the minimum conditions required specific to the establishment or maintenance of policies, procedures, and systems necessary for designing, developing, delivering, and assessing micro-credentials in Jamaica. The micro-credential standards are aligned to the Tertiary Qualifications Framework and the National Qualifications Framework to facilitate and guide the development of learning outcomes needed at the different qualification levels, including the prior learning track. The standards are intended to assist institutions and training providers in focusing on their internal quality mechanisms that seek to influence the strategy and purpose of their micro-credential offerings. Secondly, a system in managing stakeholder feedback and industry engagement. Thirdly, to develop a system in developing stakeholder learning outcomes and coordinating sound assessment practices. The standards also emphasize the commitment by the UCJ to the process of building employees' skills and competencies, leading to the process of workforce development through the acquisition of small volumes of learning. It is our hope that from today's session, you will have an appreciation of the value and benefits of designing and pursuing micro-credentials for the workplace, institution, and the learner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Heron, for your welcome and opening remarks. I'm sure that we all feel welcome. And we're ready now to hear from the Honourable Fayval Williams, Minister of Education and Youth, for her special remarks. Minister Williams.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me acknowledge Mr. Najee Murray, your Director of Public Relations and Communications, and today's moderator. Let me acknowledge as well Mrs. Althea Heron, Executive Director, UCJ, Mr. Metri Siaga, President, Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, other members of the UCJ, other distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues. Good afternoon again. Mrs. Heron, you cannot imagine the joy that I am feeling right now to see the words launch of the University Council of Jamaica micro-credential standards. I am overjoyed. This is a significant milestone in our journey towards promoting lifelong learning, increased certification, and enhancing the quality of education in Jamaica. As everyone may know, micro-credentials, these mini qualifications that demonstrate skills, knowledge, and experience in a specific subject area or capability, have been gaining momentum since 2020, as you said earlier on, Mrs. Heron. So yes, it's been out there 3 years, better late than never. And we know that this is due to the increased demand for shorter work-ready programs. They're increasingly becoming the preferred choice for certification in the workplace and are being used as a flexible way of recognizing and valuing learning obtained formally and informally. Jamaica is on par with the global higher education community in developing and promoting the use of micro-credentials as flexible learning pathways. And I'm happy to see that the UCJ has a director of communications, because I want you to blanket Jamaica with this knowledge about micro credentials, what it is, how it's used. I want our business sector to know about it. And I'm sure they will be happy to use it, because they want their workforce to have higher levels of certification. They don't necessarily want persons to leave the job and for a long period of time to go and get, an elaborate degree. But this is a way in which workers can remain engaged while at the same time upskilling and retooling. So these pathways are crucial for entering higher education, progressing through higher education, and completing a qualification. It's about retooling, reskilling for the workplace, pursuing work-based learning and training, and again, engaging in lifelong learning, which is something we have been championing, and other sectors of the society have been championing this lifelong learning. The recent report of the Reform of Education in Jamaica, which was completed in 2021, prepared by the Education Transformation Commission, led by Professor Orlando Patterson, a son of the soil, identified flexible learning pathways through micro-credentials as an urgent area for development. And so I am going to, have a ceremony to put my check mark beside this one as being completed in terms of the work that UCJ has done. As you know, coming out of that report, there are 365 recommendations. And we are down the road with almost 100 of them. Of course, they have to be sequenced. They have to be over some period of time, but the work is going on in earnest. And this afternoon is a demonstration of that. Yes, it started before the report, but it's the credit of the UCJ in recognizing this as an important development in the higher education sector. The recognition of micro-credentials date back to 2005 when the UCJ developed its standards for the accreditation of short courses. Last September, the UCJ established a committee to develop standards and guidelines for micro-credentials built on its short courses provisions. The membership was drawn from local and international professionals who are working in higher education and includes, of course, representatives from Heart NSTA Trust, the Vocational Training Development Institute, VTDI, higher education institutions, the Jamaica Employers Federation, and the private sector organization of Jamaica. As we launch the UCJ's micro-credential standards today, we're not just celebrating a milestone, we're also embracing a future where education is flexible, accessible, and tailored to the needs of our learners and our nation. I am confident that these standards will play a pivotal role in shaping the future of education in Jamaica. As you know, in this rapidly evolving world, the traditional model of education is being challenged. The need for continuous learning and upskilling is more critical than ever. Micro-credentials provide a solution to this challenge. They offer a way for individuals to stay relevant in their fields, acquire new skills, and demonstrate their competencies in a tangible way. The introduction of UCJ's micro-credential standards is a testament to our commitment to adapt and innovate in the face of change. They represent a significant step towards making education more accessible and relevant to all Jamaicans. By recognizing and valuing informal and formal learning, we're breaking down barriers to education and opening up new opportunities for individuals to learn and grow. Furthermore, these standards are not just about recognizing learning. They are about fostering a culture, and again, I'll never get tired of repeating this, a culture of lifelong learning. They encourage individuals to take ownership of their learning journey, to seek out new knowledge and skills, and to continually strive for personal and professional growth. As we move forward, we must continue to innovate and adapt. We must continue to strive for excellence in education. And most importantly, we must continue to put our learners at the center of everything we do. Launching the UCJ's micro-credential standards is a significant step in this direction, and it accords and aligns with the transformation in education. You may have seen our campaign, or public relations campaign, which we are calling TREND, Transforming Education for National Development, TREND. This forms part of that. And so I want to express my gratitude to everyone involved in this initiative. Your hard work and dedication and perseverance have made this possible. Let us continue to work together to continue to shape the future of education in Jamaica. And so I'll end by saying, education is trending right now, trending in a big way. Thank you so much, UCJ, and all who've worked to make this moment a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Williams. Education is trending right now, and education will continue to trend forever as we break down barriers to education. Now, we've heard your urgent call to action, rather, for the communications to be ramped up as we promote micro-credentials throughout this country for the betterment of not just ourselves, but also our region and our international community. And I like the point of fostering lifelong learning, because if we're not learning for life, then, you know, what are we earning? Thank you, Minister, and we look forward to hearing far much more from you as we go on today and forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. Now we move on to our Senior Standards Development Officer, Mr. David Mayers. And following Mr. Mayers, we'll be having a Q&A segment, which we will be fielding questions about our micro-credential standards. Mr. Mayers, I'm sure you have a lot to say, and we're handing right over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I hope I'm being heard and heard well.
Yes, sir.
All right, protocols being observed. Good afternoon again, colleagues. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today for this momentous occasion. And those were some kind words by the minister, and I am inspired even more now to present these standards to you. Now, it is indeed my pleasure to deliver this feature for the UCJ's standards and guidelines for microcredentials. My aim is to sustain your interest during this disclosure, and I trust that you will leave this event with more confidence and knowledge about the world of microcredentials and the UCJ's approach to quality assurance in this regard. Now, today, my focus will be around several aspects of the standards document, which has been developed for educational institutions, training organizations, and other providers. We will explore a few of the factors that led to the development of these standards. We're also going to look at what are microcredentials and how do we define them. That's very important. This will lead us to explore some of the general principles of microcredentials and what are at the core, or what are the core factors for good microcredential. We'll then set out to get into how microcredentials may be designed and what kind of problems they should solve. We're then going to deep dive into the standards and look at examples of criteria and evidence being subject to the QA process. Now, to support this, I'll also share a summary of how to interpret the standards, and we'll conclude with a few key takeaways and next steps, followed by your questions and comments. So with that said, let's get started. Now, much has been said by both the UCJ and the Honourable Minister on some of the background factors that led to the development of the microcredentials. As early as 2005, we're aware the UCJ had launched its guidelines to the accreditation of short courses, and microcredentials aren't much different to traditional short courses. It's the way in which they're packaged now and what the demands of the educational and professional environment require of that certification is why now the buzz term microcredentials is around and why we have to embrace it and follow it. Now, the UCJ's mandate and activities over the past 3.5 decades, one major thing comes to mind, and that is that it anticipates and responds to shifts in the educational sector. So it was natural for the UCJ to go about updating some of its quality criteria regarding not only microcredentials, but also distance education. Those are the second edition of those standards were launched and published just last year in 2022. So the quality assurance of flexible programming online, via distance, and short courses is not new to the UCJ. We've been doing this for quite some time, but we felt as though, given the shifts in the environment, that it was time to update our standards and to develop new standards. So against this backdrop, the development of the standards and guidelines for microcredential was not only complementary, but necessary. Now, this is a good point of departure for us today. What are microcredentials? Now, microcredentials are many things. to many people. We can think of terms such as continuing professional education, on-the-job training, adult education, short courses, MOOCs or massive open online courses, seminars and workshops, just to name a few. Now, micro-credentials do not necessarily represent old thinking, but if we ponder on some of those terms that were mentioned before, you would agree that they certainly aren't new. But despite the complex issues surrounding micro-credentials, they're actually quite simple at the core. A micro-credential may be considered a course of study, and it's also a certification. This is the same for other levels of qualifications, from certificates to higher degrees. Now you can see on this graphic here, there are various persons along this ladder. If we want to call this a lifelong learning ladder, we can see that there are persons who are steeped in their profession. There are some persons who are just graduating. There's some persons who are at different stages in their professional and personal development. And what micro-credentials seek to do is form that bridge between learners and between different milestones in their life. So what are micro-credentials? At their core, they're small volumes of learning. It's a record of learning outcomes that a learner has acquired following a course of study. It's also knowledge, skills, and competencies acquired across various fields or areas and gathered through assessed life and work experience. And that's very important because it crosses that nexus between formal and informal learning. We learn every day in many different environments, under many different circumstances. How can we be proactive as educational providers, as higher education institutions and training organizations to certify that type of learning? This is already done across the landscape here in many ways, but we're putting more focus on it through these standards. Now, micro-credentials also enable professional and personal development. It helps persons to move up this ladder. Because at their core, micro-credentials also have standalone value to support either professional, technical, academic, or personal progression for learners. Now, in the standards document, the UCJ has carefully defined a definition for micro-credentials. And it was inspired, obviously, by the work of our standards committee and their research. Now, this definition was actually referenced by UNESCO just last year in 2022. So if we had to put all that information about what micro-credentials are in the previous slide, and we put it together here, we could see that a definition of a micro-credential is a certified small volume of learning which attests to knowledge, skills, and competencies, including autonomy, responsibility, and life skills in a specific area or field. Now, it may be acquired through assessed life and work experience or a dedicated course of study, short course. Micro-credentials support professional and personal development of the learners, and they may also be combined into larger qualifications. Now, we're going to look at some general principles of micro-credentials and what makes a good micro-credential at its core. The first element is that it's outcomes-based, and that each unit of learning should be underpinned by competency-based teaching and learning and assessment with clearly established and measurable learning outcomes. There must be a goal, there must be a point that the learner is progressing towards at the end of that micro-credential. Now, as we mentioned earlier, they're also targeted, small, and short, hence the name micro. An effective micro-credential should be problem-solving or filling a gap in critical education or training, and may be designed as a targeted, group-focused short course, or for a specified group. Now, micro-credentials are also stackable. It should enable learners to acquire multiple awards over time, leading to an accrual of skills, competencies, and knowledge that facilitate career progression through those flexible learning pathways that the Honourable Minister just mentioned. They should also be industry-driven. Over the last, I would say, decade, and more increasingly of now, we know that our institutions have forged greater partnerships with industry, whether it be through working groups, committees, joint committees, boards of oversight, etc. And we really want to continue to encourage that, because micro-credentials should include some level of engagement and feedback with industry players, incorporating labor market data to identify the knowledge, skills, and competency gaps that are relevant to the economy. They're also accessible. The Honourable Minister mentioned accessibility. And the truth is that at their core, micro-credentials aren't only offered in a brick and mortar classroom. That may be their origin, that may be the tradition, but a good micro-credential, and to gain access to untapped markets, micro-credentials should also be considered for delivery, both online, face-to-face, and blended, and utilize a variety of delivery methods, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, or self-paced. Because persons should be able not only to have to sit and interact with instructors if needed, but also be able to consume content at their own pace, whether it's on a tablet, a smartphone, or a laptop. There's flexibility and accessibility at the core of micro-credentials. Lastly, micro-credentials should be verifiable. They're also a certification, a credential. And the institution or training provider should be able to deploy appropriate technology to store and safeguard the learner's personal information and achievements. That is, again, key to the general principles of micro-credentials. These are what the experts, what the market is saying in terms of what micro-credentials are and should be. We're now going to quickly move into just showcasing elements of what a good micro-credential should look like upon completion. Now, if we're presenting a learner with a micro-credential, some of the key elements should include the title of the micro-credential, the name of the issuer, date of the issue, the learning outcomes, whether it's guided learning hours or self-paced, but the notional workload in terms of time spent and credits, where applicable, should also be represented, as well as the qualification level of the learning experience. And we know that with the NQFJ, there are the various levels of learning, the access points, and the higher education points. So wherever on that scale, on that framework, the micro-credential is placed, it should be represented as well. The assessment type should also be there, and the type of quality assurance that has been utilized for that micro-credential, whether it's internal or external. Now, what this does is that when the learner completes that credential with this type of information, once it's coming from a reputable institution, or it's even coming from a regular training provider or other type of institution, there's information here that can be quickly verified, and it can be represented or shared with other persons who may find it relevant, whether it be employers, whether it be other training organizations, so that persons can go on to further study for matriculation, etc. But these are the key elements of the actual credential that should be represented. And these are just here as a guide. Now, in terms of how micro-credentials should work, of course, they're the micro units which lead then to a stackable award or cluster award. And this is important as we go in now to the design considerations for micro-credentials. These are the basic ideas that should be considered when persons are designing or conceptualizing micro-credentials. Now, the first one is that appropriate providers may use the qualification plans under the NVQJ or other local and international certification bodies that are recognized by the UCJ. These units may be clustered in response to express needs by employers or specific requests by learners in order to fulfill employment-related needs and for lifelong learning. This is very important. A second consideration for the design is what we consider the traditional short course or standalone course, which is a course or courses from a formal qualification that has been purposefully designed to be offered in smaller portions that are stackable, resulting in a macro award and are therefore credit rated. And in the example that I showed on the previous slide in terms of how micro-credentials are built or comprised, you saw in that diagram the 1, 2, 3, 4 micro-credentials that led to a stackable award. So as you go about designing these credentials, this is another stream that can be utilized to frame or design credentials to solve a particular gap or need. Is there demand for those courses from the formal qualification? Because what it allows, this second consideration is access to learners who may not have been able to pursue 2, 3, or 4-year programs, but they are able to pursue single or a cluster of courses based on individual and personal circumstances. It may be affordability, it may be schedule, it may be the level of competence, but persons may need to take an alternative path to a macro award as opposed to the traditional award. And this second design consideration allows us to take elements from programs and place them in a purposeful way for persons to pursue macro awards, stackable awards over a particular period of time. Now, the third consideration is one that's geared a bit more to corporate providers or private trainers. Now, these are specially designed small volumes of learning required to fill skills or competency gaps in the workplace. So, So say, for instance, there's a new policy that's going to be implemented from a regional office, or there's a new piece of legislation that persons need to become familiar with. A small volume of learning could be designed and developed specifically for that group. And with this premise, there's targeted knowledge, skills, and competencies which are reflected in the learning outcomes for that identified training. And then providers may then certify the learner at specified levels according to the design of the training. Micro-credentials of this classification may be offered to interested persons for the purpose of upskilling or reskilling. And we hear those terms very often, but at their core, why do persons need to upskill or reskill? Could it be shifts in the global environment? Could it be impending redundancy, corporate downsizing? Could it be the need for a new technology or legislation to be deployed? Persons are constantly in need of new knowledge. And so these design considerations kind of provide a trifecta, if you would say, of how we can go about structuring and designing micro-credentials based on the needs of the market. Now, we've had a bit of background in terms of what micro-credentials are, what makes a good micro-credential, how we should go about designing them. And now we're at the point where we want to introduce the standards. Now, by and large, the standards have been guided by benchmarks internationally and regionally, as well as the design considerations and the general principles that we would have discussed just a short while ago. So you'll see some of that reflected within the standards. Oops. Now, why do we need these standards? They're here to provide institutions, organizations, and training providers with the minimum conditions required to develop, design, and deliver quality micro-credentials. It's also to assist stakeholders across the system in strengthening their internal quality assurance mechanisms. Keyword there, strengthen, because they should already be in place. But in the case where they are not, it would also assist in establishing. And it will also assist those stakeholders in guiding your strategy and purpose of the micro-credential offerings. And in so doing, we're encouraging the management of stakeholder feedback and industry engagement, the development of strong student learning outcomes, and the coordination of sound assessment practices. This is going to lead to increased flexibility for the integration of micro-credentials into existing program portfolios while expanding capacity to meet industry needs. It will also assist in the advancement of competency-based practice in determining that learning outcomes have been met. It's not just what we say we can do, but what we can demonstrate as well. And finally, these standards will allow a well-articulated framework to be in place for the design, development, and delivery of micro-credentials that meet established standards. Now, the first standard, and there are 9, I didn't say that before, but there are 9 criterion, yeah? The first one is that the micro-credentials shall be designed to ensure an appropriate balance between theory and practice. And the indicator here is that the curriculum should be guided by those competency-based education and training principles. Now, education and training institutes are advised to review and research competency statements, occupational profiles, and job and task analyses as a means of creating balance between demand and supply thinking in the development of competency-based like training. The second standard, the development of micro-credentials shall be guided by relevant and available evidence-based resources. The indicator there is that it should be underpinned by relevant labor market data and or training needs analyses. Now, why? A review of the labor market is critical to understand end user preferences, such as skill and competency gaps, desired price points, and preferred delivery modalities. This approach will ensure medium to long-term success of an institution's product offerings. You need to consult with the market. Stakeholders, for number 3, should allow for adequate provision of engagement and feedback from internal and external sources in the design and development process. Now, the indicator there is that course materials should be developed in consultation with relevant technical experts and industry practitioners, whether this is done through curriculum committees or curriculum specialists who are contracted or employed to the institutions, but the linkage is necessary. Stakeholders must be engaged to ensure that there are acceptable levels of relevance and currency within their fields of practice, whether that's medicine, engineering, accounting, banking, finance, you name it. The feedback is necessary to ensure that the markets we're going after or the skills we're transferring to those learners have currency in the workplace, can take them places, can move them up a particular competency ladder or job scale. Yeah. Moving on to the next tranche of these standards, we're seeking to encourage and we're imploring institutions that their credentials should be aligned with the skills outlined in the NQFJ at the level at which the learner is being trained. So if it is an advanced credential for a postgraduate student, or it's for a senior manager, or it's for an executive, it should be aligned in a concentrated way to the skills levels on the NQFJ. And our indicator here is that learning outcomes and content should match those established by national and international bodies. Now, the reason for this is that learners should acquire the competencies identified by those stakeholders, and there should be proper alignment to ensure effective personal and professional development. We're also implying or encouraging that these credentials should have clearly defined standards that will guide the teaching and learning at the appropriate level. So if the particular micro-credential is for persons who are in the workplace, but who only have entry-level qualifications, or similarly, as we mentioned before, for executives or persons with advanced degrees, the teaching and learning standards and strategies and instructional methods should align to the practices in place with national and international bodies. So whether that is particular teaching and learning strategies or instructional strategies or taxonomic approaches in terms of how we assess, those need to be employed within the credential and customized based on the learning level. Yeah. The credential should also be designed, this is standard 6, to enable ease of use, portability, and stackability. Now, what does that mean? It means, in terms of indicators, we're looking to ensure the development of accessible pathways. We mentioned this earlier, to support learners in achieving full qualifications. So if you can go through 4 or 6 micro-credentials to gain a macro-credential at a particular level, that should be purposefully designed into the credential to show where the stepping on and stepping off points are. Now, can those lead to larger awards? That is what the intention here is. And for the last 3 criterion, we're looking more internally. We're asking, or again, implying and encouraging that micro-credentials be monitored and revised on a systematic basis to incorporate improvements. And what should be done to support this? Institutions should assess the effectiveness of that credential based on layers of feedback from learners, from stakeholders, from other research and professional practice. So how have persons with a particular credential performed over a 3-month, 6-month, 1 year, 2-year period? That feedback needs to come back to the organizations and the institutions delivering these credentials so that we can track the effectiveness of that credential and if it is making the desired change and impact in the workplace. That is essential. This should take the form of course evaluations, joint committees, or other stakeholder feedback and engagement activities. For standard 8, again, internally looking, assessments completed or leading to the award of the micro-credential should be appropriate, valid, and reliable. Now, the methods of assessment must be appropriate to the level of the micro-credential. And we mentioned early in terms of the learning outcomes should be at the appropriate level. Well, to get to the learning outcomes, we need the assessment to bridge that gap between instruction and certification. And so the modes of delivery and the learning outcomes vis-a-vis the assessment methods that are employed should be appropriate based on the level of the qualification or the level of the award. And the final standard or criterion, again, inward looking, encouraging institutions to ensure that their resource provisions for the delivery of micro-credentials are suitable and adequate. What this is saying is that sustainability is key. We all hear the development goals and the national development plans. We have to take it on a micro level and it will be replicated at the macro level. If we instill quality in everything we do, excellence will follow. And so the physical and technological resources must be appropriate and sufficient to support delivery. Now, some of the key questions for reflection here is, does the provider have the physical resources needed to support delivery? Does the institution possess the resources, both human and financial, to sustain the programs on offer? Are the administrative staff appropriately qualified? And do they possess the skills and experience to support teaching and learning? And does the institution have support systems for learners that include technological support? These things are important because the new learner, the 21st century learner, the 2030 learner and beyond is not the learner of the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even 5 years ago. We need to meet learners where they are. We always say that. And so it's not that you're making things easy for them, but you're supporting them through their journey so that they get exactly what they came for, so that that learning is transformative and they can take those skills and knowledge back to the workplace, back to their businesses, back to their fields of practice and impact real change. And we've come to the end of the standard, but we're going to look now quickly at some guidelines for interpreting those standards. Now, I've tried to do this, I tried to do some of this earlier, but in a formal way, micro-credentials must be aligned to the job competencies and profiles, as we mentioned. They should also be offered in response to demands from industry, employers, and learners. Institutions should strive to establish good guidelines to support a clear understanding of the value of micro-credentials within that institution and between institutions. So if I take this program at institution X, where can I go with other qualifications or credentials over a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year period? Similarly, if circumstances or conditions change and I'd like to pursue a qualification somewhere else, can this qualification or credential at institution X be accepted by institution Y? These are some of the questions that have to be addressed, have to be considered, because the learner is the focus here. As educational providers, assessors, instructors, practitioners, we need learners for us to continue doing what we do. So we have to put them at the center of our design considerations. Now, assessment should also align with the learning outcomes, skills, and knowledge, as we mentioned before, to ensure effective personal and professional development. Instructors should also utilize the latest instructional methods and technologies to appeal to a diverse group of learners. In 2021, Deloitte published a Future of Higher Education report. And what they mentioned, a key element in that is the new professor, the new ways of doing things. And so gamification of learning, as well as other key design principles that appeal to our Gen Zs and Gen Ys, need to be incorporated into our design, into our teaching and learning, because we're dealing with a different type of learner now, almost a social media learner that needs bite-sized information that's appealing and attractive, that builds on competencies almost daily so that they can see their progression. Finally, institutions and training providers must identify and secure resources necessary, as we mentioned, for the sustainable delivery of their qualifications. Now, in the standards document, which will be available soon, online and both in print, the standards and the guidelines follow each other. And you would use the guidelines to interpret the standards and understand the rationale and thinking behind why the standards were designed in the way they were. So it's a very clear-cut, straightforward, but complementary type of document that allows anyone almost to pick it up and follow exactly what we're trying to inspire within institutions where micro-credentials are concerned. Now, this is where the rubber hits the road. Evidence. The quality assurance process for micro-credentials, when we reach that bridge, is going to require some information. So each of the standards and indicators that were mentioned in the preceding slides also have samples or sources of evidence that are required to substantiate compliance. And some of these things are natural and normal for established institutions, experienced training providers, leading universities, community colleges, etc., teacher training colleges. This is what you do. So this may be nothing new to you. For others, maybe for corporate campuses and smaller providers, you may learn something new here. But supporting those standards are things like curricula and program documents, course outlines, needs analyses, labor market data, stakeholder feedback reports, internal decision-making processes or evidence of internal decision-making, curriculum mapping, that's particularly important for the NVQ and NQF, learner feedback to incorporate that internal and feedback mechanism for systematic monitoring. Same thing for course and program review and resource listings. Supporting these documents within the organization, institution, or provider should be evidence of policies and procedures. And these are the core ones. Of course, there will be many others that support the organization in different ways, but these are the ones we've identified that are closely supporting compliance to the standard. And this includes course and program development, course administration, program review or course review, instructor recruitment, very important, staff development, and maintaining and replacing physical resources. So when you get to interrogate the standard document, you would see very closely the standard, the criteria, and the evidence. And those in concert provide the type of context that we believe would be easy or allow simplification of the standard so that institutions can work together with us to provide quality programming. I'm cognizant of the time and we do want to encourage feedback. So we're going to look at some key takeaways and next steps. Now, the UCJ has been known over the last 3.5 decades almost to employ a process of program accreditation for course and programs of varied lengths of study. They call it the program accreditation process. It is robust. It takes good effort. But this process that we're looking to adapt for micro-credentials is going to be a little different. The process will be guided by the institution's status with the UCJ and the type of micro-credential that is being evaluated. You may recall the design considerations earlier. The competency-based one, the ones from formal qualifications, or the third one that's specific to addressing specific skills and competency gaps. Now, institutions that are already accredited with the UCJ with a strong internal quality assurance system will benefit from a more concise QA process for micro-credentials. Now, this is especially important for the credentials that are drawn from existing programs that may be combined or stacked for learners to receive a macro award. So if your institution is already accredited by the UCJ and your programs come under that umbrella, and you're extracting particular courses from a program such as that, you will benefit from a much more concise process because there's maturity within that institution as it relates to internal quality and providing quality programming. So we won't be asking you to reinvent the wheel or redefine your context. Certainly not. Similarly, institutions that are in the process of registration with the UCJ, legacy institutions that have already submitted and have received accreditation for their programs will also benefit from this flexibility. This is especially important again for institutions that are growing and maturing in that internal quality assurance process, because the UCJ's main aim is to develop that IQA competency or function within institutions so that it runs almost on autopilot. We come and check ever so often that things are being adhered to and maintained, but there's a strong sense of value for internal quality assurance and quality assurance in general at institutions. However, all other institutions will be encouraged to participate in the QA process for micro-credentials, but they may be required to demonstrate full compliance with the standards because they don't have that umbrella or overarching coverage of program or institutional accreditation. And so they'll have to demonstrate a bit more closely that they're following the standards to the letter. Some of that information might be new. Now, for instance, this may include new or existing training organizations and providers that are not registered with the UCJ. And in that case, they'd have to complete their registration with the Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, JTEC. Afterwards, these entities will be invited to submit their micro-credentials for evaluation by the UCJ, or encouraged, I should say. Now, institutions, both large and small, public and private, are reminded that the award of micro-credentials shall be supported through digital badging from reputable online providers. Now, regarding badging, there's a key misconception sometimes that a micro-credential is a digital badge. That's actually not true. Micro-credentials are sometimes represented as digital badges, but they're not one and the same. Digital badges have their evolution in the gaming industry, and they were designed really to incentivize learning or actions or demonstration of skills. And they can be used for many different types of activities, not just formal learning or informal learning. Digital badges in and of themselves are governed by international standard called Open Badges 2.0. And basically all reputable digital badging platforms comply with that open badge standard. Some of these solutions are either cloud-based with SaaS as software as a service, or some of them are blockchain-based. So it will all depend on the institution's budget and internal capacity to support digital badging. There are dozens of online platforms, but the top 10 include Credly from Pearson Education, Accreditable, Certifier, Certify Me, and Parchment. And we'll share this presentation and you could look those institutions, those softwares up at your leisure. But just as a takeaway, the market now requires digital badges for persons because they're shareable. You can put them in your email signature, share them on social media. People love them. Finally, the process for micro-credentials, the QA process, will be piloted in the upcoming 24-2025 academic year. It will be automated utilizing the council's UCJ's IQAM system. The details and the length of the process, we're fine-tuning that and we'll be introducing that to the market in a very short order, or relatively short order, I should say. Now, this standards document should be used in conjunction with the NQFJ and JTEX credit accumulation and transfer policy, especially as it relates to credentials being recognized by other institutions and what credit value can be taken to those institutions. Finally, the standards document will be available to registered and accredited institutions via our website from next week. And printed copies will be available for purchase from the UCJ by the first week of December 2023. Now we're almost at the end, and I just wanted to represent here quickly for you our next steps. We're going to have you access the published standards online in November, printed copies first week of December. We will have a standards implementation workshop where we can deep dive into the standard and get more practical experience on implementing various aspects of it. This will be hosted as a follow-up activity during the UCJ's Quality Assurance Week of activities in March 2024. That's an annual event, and we found rather than trying to condense it into today's activities, we'll give you a little time to interrogate the standard, and then we'll host the implementation workshop early in the new year or the last quarter of the fiscal year for us. And you'll get a chance to interrogate the standard and get more practical experience with it. We'll then be testing and launching that process over the upcoming year. And then within the next academic year, once that process is launched, we will be integrating micro-credentials into the UCJ's quality database. So on our website, you can go and search for accredited courses and programs. Micro-credentials will be no different. And at this time, I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. And I trust that this presentation was of some use to you. I thank you, and I'll hand back over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Myers, for your presentation, very detailed presentation. And I'm sure if I didn't know much about micro-credentials before, I know more now. At this time, we'll take some questions. I'm sure there must be questions that we have to ask. I just ask Mr. Myers to remind us again when we'll have access to the standards and how we can get access to them as well.
Most certainly. Access to the standards will be for registered and accredited institutions will be as soon as Monday of next week. It'll be on our website, accessible through secure login. For all other institutions that are not accredited or registered with the UCJ, we should have them in stock and available at our offices by the first week of December. Hopeful that by December 4th or so, we can have those for distribution. I believe they're retailed at a cost of $2,000 Jamaica.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Myers. Any other questions that we could, or we'd like to save them for when we have the micro-credentials workshop in March of next year? just a reminder that in March of next year, Quality Assurance in Higher Education Week will be coming up, and the UC, as a part of our offerings for that year, we will be speaking about the implementation of the macro-credential standards and giving you some further details about it as well. So there's a question here, Mr. Mayers, where we're asked if stakeholder institutions were engaged in review of the standards.
Most definitely. That list of institutions is not to hand, but I am aware, and Mrs. Heron mentioned it as well, that in June of 2022, the document was shared with institutions to provide feedback. Usually in our standards process, that feedback process culminates with an in-person event as well, where persons get to give their detailed feedback on how they see the standards being applied.
Thank you, Mr. Mayers. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat at current, but as I said, I feel like persons are still mulling over the information and will be gearing up for their questions when we get to the QA week session. Yes, the standards can be purchased by individuals. That's something that Mr. Mayers also shared as well. And I believe he said the cost will come at 2,500. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Mayers.
I can't sanction that price.
But definitely the standards can be purchased by individuals at the UCJ. And again, they can be accessed by institutions on our website starting next week, Monday. Yes. So I believe that is it then. If I'm not seeing any other questions coming up in the chat, I want to thank you everyone for participating in this afternoon's function, the University Council of Jamaica launching its macro-credential standards. It really stands as a testament to the collective commitment of quality in education and in innovation. As we conclude this momentous event, I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our stakeholders and contributors as well. Macro-credentials embodies a transformative approach, providing agile, industry-aligned learning opportunities. These standards do not only elevate the quality of education, but also align with the Jamaica's Vision 2030, fostering knowledge-driven and globally competitive society. I encourage this continued collaboration and thank you again for your contribution. Here is the transformative impact of macro-credentials in the shaping of our education landscape. Happy logging off and thank you for coming.
Thank you, colleagues, again for your time. We will be in touch.